They called them plague ships. Silent vessels drifting into European harbors, sails sagging like torn shrouds, their crews half dead or already rotting. In the mid-14th century, no horror was greater than seeing one of these ships appear on the horizon because it did not carry wealth, trade, or adventure. It carried the Black Death. And once it docked, once its anchors clanged into the harbor waters, death itself seemed to spill into the streets. But how did these floating coffins bring about the darkest chapter in human history? To understand this, we must follow the path of the ships themselves and the chain of events that turned them into the vehicles of Europe's greatest catastrophe. It began far from Europe, on the steppes of Asia. There, in the early 1300s, the plague bacteria had been simmering in rodent populations for centuries. Carried by fleas, it leapt from animal to animal, thriving in nests and burrows. But the Mongol Empire's vast network of roads and trading posts connected east to west like never before. For merchants, it was a golden highway of riches. For the plague, it was a highway of death. Somewhere along that route, the disease found passage onto caravans, then to bustling ports along the Black Sea, where Italian merchants ran thriving trade colonies. In 1346, one of these colonies, the Genoese-controlled city of Kaffa in Crimea, found itself under siege by Mongol forces. The attackers, suffering from plague in their own ranks, allegedly catapulted corpses over the city walls, turning warfare into a grotesque weapon of infection. Whether by catapult or simple contact, the plague entered the city. The Genoese traders, desperate to escape, fled by sea. Their ships, loaded with silks, spices, and furs, also carried something far more sinister: rats and fleas infected with plague. When those ships sailed westward, they were unknowingly sailing the pestilence straight into the heart of Europe. The voyage took weeks. In the dark holds, rats scurried, fleas fed, and sailors began to cough, swell, and die. By the time the ships reached Messina in Sicily in October 1347, the vessels had already become floating charnel houses. Chroniclers wrote that when the people of Messina saw the ships enter their harbor, they recoiled in horror. Sailors lay twisted and feverish on the decks, their bodies covered with black swellings in the groin and armpits. Death was so rampant that crews were often too weak to throw their own dead overboard, so corpses piled in corners and cabins. But the real danger was invisible. Fleas abandoned the cooling bodies of rats and men, leaping onto the dockside when the gangplanks dropped. And with those leaps, the plague leapt too, into Messina, into Sicily, and from there across the Mediterranean like a spreading fire. From Messina, the ship sailed north, stopping at Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. Each harbor received the same dreadful gift. The chroniclers speak of ships of death that came into port with hardly a living soul aboard. Some coastal towns tried to bar them, chasing them back out to sea with armed guards or flaming arrows. But the plague was already loose. Rats carried it ashore. Merchants and sailors, even asymptomatic, walked off carrying the invisible seeds of doom. No matter how many ports tried to seal themselves, the ships had already done their work. By 1348, France, Spain, and North Africa were ablaze with plague. Ships carried it up the Atlantic coast, into England, and even across to Norway and Iceland. Maritime trade, once the pride of Europe, had become the instrument of its devastation. The very lifeline that brought wealth and culture now brought only disease. For those who watched these ships arrive, the terror was beyond imagination. Imagine a bustling harbor filled with the cries of traders, fishermen, and children. Then over the horizon, a vessel appears. Its sails are slack, its flag perhaps hanging upside down as a signal of distress. It glides into the bay with eerie silence. As dock workers board, they find the crew dead, blackened with pestilence, their eyes sunken and lips blue. The stench of rot fills the air. Word spreads instantly through the town. The plague has come. Mothers clutch their children. Markets collapse. Priests rush to churches. And within days, death itself stalks every alley. No one understood the true cause. To them, it was divine punishment, or poisoned air, or even the malevolence of outsiders. The ships were seen as cursed objects, carriers of some unnatural pestilence. Townspeople sometimes tried to set them ablaze at sea, hoping fire would purify what water had delivered. But nothing worked. The plague followed trade routes inland, spreading like an invisible army. One of the most chilling stories comes from the port of Marseille. There in late 1347, a Genoese ship entered harbor. Within weeks, tens of thousands were dead. By the time the authorities realized the danger, it was too late. The city's graveyards overflowed. Gravediggers themselves fell to the sickness. Bodies rotted in homes and streets, and the sea breeze carried the stench of death across the harbor. What had begun with a single ship became a nightmare that consumed the entire city. And so it went, port after port, coast after coast. The Black Death was a sea-borne invasion, but unlike armies or pirates, it had no face, no banner, no mercy. Its fleet was made of ordinary ships, merchant galleys, trading cogs, vessels of commerce. They were not warships, but their impact was greater than any war ever fought. By 1351, the plague had ravaged nearly all of Europe. Some chroniclers estimated that 1/3 of the continent's population was gone, perhaps 25 million souls. And when they looked back, they remembered the ships. They remembered how death had not marched at first, but sailed, creeping across the waters, entering their world quietly, invisibly, until it consumed them. The plague ships left behind more than death. They changed how people viewed the sea, trade, and strangers. Ports that once welcomed ships with joy began to fear them. Maritime laws slowly adapted, introducing the idea of quarantine, 40 days of isolation for ships suspected of carrying sickness. The very word quarantine comes from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days. It was a desperate attempt to prevent another wave of plague ships from destroying civilization again. Yet the memory lingered. For generations, stories were told of ghost ships drifting silently, cursed with the souls of the dead, omens of disease and despair. Sailors whispered of seeing such vessels on misty nights, spectral reminders of the time when ships were not symbols of exploration or discovery, but of death itself. Even centuries later, during outbreaks of plague, people spoke of the ships that had once carried doom across the seas. They had become more than historical memory. They had become legend, dark myths to warn children and frighten sailors. And perhaps rightly so, because in truth, those ships had once carried the end of the world in their holds. The Black Death's greatest weapon was not its suddenness nor its lethality, but the simple, ordinary trade routes that humans had built with such pride. The plague did not need armies, it needed ships. And through those ships, it conquered Europe. So the next time you imagine the age of sail, with its proud captains and distant voyages, remember the other side of the story. The vessels that crept into harbors not with treasure, but with death. The plague ships. They were not just wooden holes on the water. They were the floating heralds of humanity's darkest hour, the messengers of a terror that would forever mark the history of Europe.